Well, today is October 28th. We're in New York City. This is the Oral History Project about Professor Walter LaFeber. I'm Lai Leong with the Center for Presidential History, and I'm here with my colleague, Greta Swain, behind the camera. Professor Brewer, would you please introduce yourself, talk about your connection to Professor LaFeber?
Yes, I'm Susan Brewer, and I was a graduate student of Walter LaFeber at Cornell. And I had gone to college at Allegheny College and studied American Studies. And then I went to Washington to work on Capitol Hill for a short time period and decided that I was much more of a scholar than an active participant in politics. And so I went to graduate school for my master's degree at the London School of Economics, and I studied international history. And I was in a class with people from all over the world, and I was the American. And I was asked a lot of questions and asked to represent sort of U.S. foreign policy. And I realized, well, I really need to find out more about this. And so I came back without much of a plan. I didn't really have a career path in mind. I ended up in Ithaca, and I sat in on one of Walt's classes and just, was enthralled by the way he presented American foreign relations, because he would talk about economic policies, strategic policies, but he would also talk about critics and these bizarre actions by individuals. He would quote poets. And I thought, well, this is me. This is a much richer exploration of foreign relations than I had been exposed to, which was much more about diplomats interacting with each other. And I wanted to study with him without really, again, having a plan of what that would mean. And I went to ask him if he would take me as a grad student, and he said no, he wasn't taking any grad students. And I just sat there because looking at him. And I realized later that I must have looked sort of like a stray puppy or something. But anyway, he relented a little bit, and he said, well, you'd have to be completely retrained. And I said, mm-hmm. And I had no idea what he was talking about, because I didn't know what it meant to be trained. And then he said, all right, well, write me a paper and do really well on the GREs and apply to grad school and see if you get in. And so I did it. I just did it. And it was, and continues to be, this amazing experience of, being his TA, being in seminar with him, having him critique my papers and later when I was writing books, And so I never realized it was a lifelong thing. I mean, he was adopting me as the puppy forever. So he was a wonderful teacher and a mentor and advisor to me.
Tell us more about how he would critique your work.
Yes, well, you would send him, this was back when we were working on actual paper. So he would have these big thick pencils, and he would write, like what, or look at this, explain this, why. Every once in a while he would write, good, and you'd be like, oh. Or he would do 2 lines and a star. Oh, yes. And then at the end, he would write almost like an essay of what I had done, which often when you're writing your own papers, you don't realize what you have and then what I could think of about to make it better. And was the kind of thing, you know, it was exactly what you needed to, it was both validating, but also really about improving and never really saying this is wrong, but you know, you need to strengthen this argument if you want to make it, that kind of thing. So yeah, I treasured those, really. I think it's really special when you get back critiques of your work and you can't wait to read it, rather than dread it.
Do you recall any conversations you've had with him? What was he like in those conversations?
Well, he, let's see, my first book, my dissertation, was on British propaganda in the United States during World War II. And I did a lot of research in London and Cambridge and the BBC archives in Reading. And I also went to Ottawa to look at the participation of the Canadians. And then I interviewed some people who were involved in doing it. And I had this amazing interview with Isaiah Berlin, who is better known as a philosopher. But during World War II, he had been posted to the British Embassy in Washington. And he had written back these, well, as you can imagine, these brilliant cables on what he was seeing in the US. So I had a chance to interview Isaiah Berlin when he was at the Library of Congress. And I came back from that interview and Walt said, what did you find out? And I talked a little bit about it, and then I said that, during the conversation, which is very one-sided with Isaiah Berlin because he's such a famous talker, Berlin mentioned that he thought Walter Lippmann, this very prominent journalist on foreign relations, he thought Walter Lippmann was a coward because he had not taken a stronger stand on what was happening to the Jews in Europe during World War II. And I said that to Walt, and Walt immediately said, well, he wasn't a coward during the Vietnam War. And also for that project, I interviewed Dean Rusk, who had been a young Army officer during World War II and involved in India and China. And I came back from that and, said that Rusk had been quite funny about the extent of his influence, even as a young officer during World War II, how much, he was drawing lines and maps and making big decisions. And Walt said, well, he wasn't funny about the Vietnam War. And I realized that how important the Vietnam War had been for Walt's, worldview, like assessing, the role of individuals in either, advocating the war or critiquing the war in Vietnam. And that was interesting to me because I was working on World War II, and even though Walt was working on many different periods of history, I felt that the Vietnam War had, well, at least at that time, was this fundamental problem in Walt's mind that he was addressing. So, and he was very good about letting you sort of go your own way. And, if I came back from some archive, he would say, well, you really, made the most of that in what you wrote about that. So I loved how he would, I had chosen a topic that I don't think was that interested in, but his attitude was, so we'll see what you can do with it, and he would let you experiment, and if it wasn't working, he would give you some advice, and he was not at all directive, I felt, in his relationship with me.
That's interesting, because that connects back to what you were saying earlier about the need to be retrained. What do you think Professor LaFeber meant when he said you needed to be retrained, and what form did that training take?
Right. Well, I think that the person who'd been my tutor at the London School of Economics was a good historian, but he sort of conveyed the attitude during our seminars that, the British Empire had done a pretty good job of running the world, and now they had turned it over to the Americans, who were making a mess of it. And understanding the necessity of working with the Americans, but really deploring the whole thing. And also not very interested in questioning this larger worldview that shaped decision makers that Walt was interested in, and that I was really interested in. And I feel like that sort of questioning, and also, coming from the progressive tradition in history, this kind of critiquing tradition rather than being more closely aligned with policymakers in analysis. I think Walt taught us to have more of a distance, while also trying to understand policymakers and what their perspectives were, but keeping that critiquing. And I never asked him, because I was just too embarrassed that I didn't know what he was talking about. And I never really saw it so much as training. It was more but it was training. It comes back as how to question things, how to put together an argument, how to make your writing compelling and interesting. And that all was part of his training.
That ties in with my next question, which is, what do you think Professor LaFeber himself would have thought about what do you think he would have identified as his own most important contributions to the study of history?
That's hard to answer for me. I think it would get back to this question of looking at what the United States says it's doing and what it's actually doing. And what do leaders say they're doing and what are they actually doing? Because that requires investigation, right? You have to look at not just speeches and claims and statements, but look at what the actual policies are and what are the consequences of those policies and why. Where are the motivations? And I feel like he was always investigating that. And with with at the heart of that this dilemma of this idea of the U.S. being a global power, a new empire, while at the same time claiming it can maintain its Republican institutions and values. And he's always looking at the stress and strain on that. And that gets at what American leaders say they're doing and what actually are the policies and results and consequences. And I think that that is like a through line in his work that he's passed on to his students.
Now, he counts quite a number of policymakers
Yes.
among his students. Did he ever share with you his thoughts on what his students were doing as policymakers?
Not with, well, in only the most, not with me. I know he did with other of his students, but, only in the, most general way, wherein he would say he thought something was idiotic or somebody clearly had not read something or other or understood X or Y. And I think that, but at the same time, he would be quite supportive and proud of them. I think he felt that, he was not at all hesitant to critique people, but he always tried to be understanding of, I think where they were and what they were doing. Why, that kind of thing. But yeah, he would express his frustrations and concerns sometimes. Yeah. Well, especially lately.
As you know, his book on the Cold War, ran into 10 editions.
Yeah.
But sadly, we're at the 10th edition, and that was, I guess, almost 20 years ago now. Do you think his work will hold up over time?
I know, I was just talking about that downstairs because the New Empire, which is the book that Bob Hannigan and I wrote about, was written in the early 60s, and it still holds up. And a lot of books written back then don't. I mean, the tone is just off, or the assumptions are just, preconceived notions just feel way out of date. And I don't think Walt's, they're certainly not of this time, but I do think they hold up. And I do think it's in part because he's always targeting this core question. And that is a fundamental question, it's at the roots of everything, And I think that that's why his work will hold up for people. It still does. People are still reading, his work that was written many decades ago, which is, really unusual.
The, academia has sort of maybe taken a turn in the sense that, and maybe it's not a turn, maybe it's just part of his development, but when we talk about foreign policy these days, we very often talk about the issue of race or gender. Mm-hmm. And these are not necessarily things that he focused on.
Right.
He was more interested in sort of, policy making in general and big power politics and so on. Do you think that his work has something to say about those topics nonetheless?
It's surprising how much it does, even though he doesn't focus on those questions, but he doesn't leave them out either, which was more typical, right? Just to leave out race and gender completely as though it had nothing to do with foreign relations. He will mention it, he will talk about how, in the New Empire, he says that American expansion was just dedicated to pushing indigenous people, Mexicans, out of the way. And that it was done with money and guns. And it was brutal. And, he'll just say that and then he'll move on to, so it's in there. He does the same thing by talking about, the Cubans or the Filipinos, saying that the consequences of U.S. policies were, devastating for these people. Even though he's still concentrating on policymakers, he does not ignore them. And I would say gender is a little bit more, it's in there in the sense that he does have a discussion of the idea of manhood influencing American policymakers, and their ideas about what it means to be I remember he would talk about this with George Washington, this idea of what it meant to be a man of stature, a man with power. So he would talk about that, and of course women were not really involved in directly in foreign policy making, but he would often mention the families of people, policymakers. He would talk about women critics of American foreign policy, like Jane Addams, for example. So he would integrate women into his work and lectures as more often critics than makers of foreign policy. It's only been fairly recently that women have played, a leadership role, and I don't think he ever really addressed that too much, although he's quite critical of some of them in his emails, what they were doing.
Do you think his ideas evolved over time?
Oh,
And if
yes.
So in what way?
Yes, well, first of all, taking women graduate students, that he had taken a few women graduate students before me, and then he took a number that were there after I was there. And I think that, he was not blind to, I think eventually, he had to realize, I think there's, he has an early email where he talks about going to the AHA to recruit young men to be professors at Cornell. It was just that was his view. But he did change to recognize that women were being hired and that there were a number of good students available to him. But we were, for us, we still remember being very outnumbered at conferences. And I remember one in particular, it was at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, and there were no women's restrooms near the conference because there were, we were like hiking down the hall because, it was such a male environment we were in there. It was just a funny moment that really brought it home, that our presence was unusual in a number of ways, at the Naval Academy. And, So, yeah, I think he did change, definitely. And, but I do think the opening was always there. It wasn't, there was more of it.
Do you think his relationships with his female students were different?
Not that I know of. I never felt that that they were. He's very demanding of everybody equally, but also very, very caring about people's whole life. Not that he was, prying or anything, but I think he was supportive of his graduate students having, life outside, although you wouldn't know that from the reading load and papers he assigned us, that we would have any kind of life outside of, graduate school.
So many people talk about his warmth.
Yeah.
I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, it's funny because it's warmth, but there's also a distance. So I was thinking of this. There was a symposium in Madison in honor of William Appleman Williams, and I went to it, and I met Jim Siekmeyer, and we had been Walt students together, and Jim had been invited to this dinner at the president's house, Donna Shalala's house, and so I just went with him and crashed this party, and so I'm at this, the cocktail hour, and this nice woman comes up to me and is talking to me and said, "Isn't this a stuffy party?" And I said, "Yes, it is." And then I said, "Well, but I crashed this party." And she said, "Oh, that's wonderful. You must sit with me." And so she takes me to her table, which I realize is the head table. And I understand that she is Mrs. William Appleman Williams. But that's not the main part, but it just explains how I came to be sitting next to this very imposing man who was Fred Harvey Harrington, who had been Walt's advisor, who asked me who I was. I did not tell him that I had crashed the party. But he was delighted that I was Walt's student, and he described Walt as, being the kind of student who would lean up against the wall with his arms folded and not say a lot. But that Fred knew he said, destined for greatness. And I feel like that kind of captures, I don't feel like Walt ever needed to promote himself. In fact, would prefer to kind of hang back and listen and then make some amazing comment, and then you'd realize, oh wow, and that Harrington said that Walt had wanted to be a novelist because he's really interested in the human story. And I feel like that's kind of where the warmth comes from, in a way, that combined with this kind of distancing, not talking about himself, not putting himself forward. Some people will say that's a Midwestern thing too, and that's possible. But I do think that his understanding of people comes from that desire to understand them as human beings. And that applies to the people in front of him, his students, his colleagues, but also to the historical figures that he is writing about. And I think that's a kind of, not a dual nature, but part of his observational qualities and his questioning as to why people do what they do, and his judgment, but not understanding. So I feel that his warmth also came with a need to be a step back, to have the ability to observe the way he did. I think that's also what makes him kind of interesting as a person. And we still can't figure out how he had time to do everything he did in a day. So, maybe he was just resting, leaning up against the wall with his arms folded. Anyway, Harrington was so proud of Walt, really proud of him. So Harrington called me his granddaughter. Yeah, so maybe, there is also that example, right? This very imposing, demanding man, Fred Harvey Harrington, who, did not suffer fools, yet he was very kind and warm to me. So I think that maybe Walt was also like his mentor that way.
So many people talk about or wonder at how Professor LaFeber had the time to do what he did. And of course, one of the things he did was to continued to communicate with his former students in so many different ways. Could you talk a little bit about, some of those exchanges you had after you left his tutelage, so to speak, and how he connected his students to each other?
Yes, so he wrote, we would keep in touch through letters and then emails, and I would see him at conferences every once in a while, although he didn't really like conferences. I didn't really like them either, so it was but we would go and, we would have coffee or lunch or something, and he liked always to write or talk about what his students were doing. And, he wouldn't puff them up, but he was, he would be very pleased with, how people were doing, what they had done. He would read. He read my second book for me, Why America Fights. He read that and sent me back some wonderful comments on it. And so he would continue to be kind of my mentor, reader, advisor, and then also connect me to people who had been a student. Some I knew of or had read their books, and now I've met a lot of those people that he wrote to me about over the years. So I feel like he was always making us this kind of, not a school of LaFeber, but we have such a common bond, which we found out doing this project and doing this, doing this conference and the workshop, that we have so much in common. And we're still, even at breakfast this morning, we're still talking through some of the problems that he sort of set for us. How do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of that? What kinds of questions should we be asking about that? So it's a lifetime project.
You were a professor. How did you model yourself? In what ways did you model yourself on Professor LaFeber?
Well, I was never able to deliver my lectures without notes like he did. That would have been such a fantasy for me to achieve. I couldn't do it. I could move around a lot, but I could not. But I think that I think one of the things that I had my students do that I really learned from him was to grapple with primary sources. That to always go back to those. Like, you can read all the historiography and you can read other people's arguments, but for you yourself, you need to go back to the primary sources and engage those and get your students to do it. And that it is this fundamental thing that you must do. And I found that to be a wonderful teaching method, is to have the students read them, discuss them, debate about them, and through that try to understand the perspective of the people at the time and how they understood what was happening and why they made the decisions that they made. And then to go from there to understand the larger policy. So I feel like he did that in a way that inspired my teaching. And I also think that the way that he would set these big questions for students always to come back to, and I tried to do that too.
I think we're ready to wrap up. Is there more that you might want to share that these prompts have not allowed you to do? I
think I just wanted to say how generous he was. That with his time, his attention. And I think that that's also a very good example that he set. But also that if you want to get anything done, you must get to it. You have to be, you can't be as disciplined, I couldn't be as disciplined as he was, but you have to be, it's a discipline. And you stick with it and you write it. I ran into him one time, his carrel in the old library was on the 5th floor. It looks kind of a cage kind of thing. And I ran into him once, and he was at the pencil sharpener, sharpening about 10 pencils. And I realized, okay, this is part of his writing discipline. He's getting his pencils ready so that he will be either writing or grading or critiquing or whatever he was doing. And he was getting 10 at once. And I thought, wow, that's a lot of pencils. There's going to be a lot of work done there. But I do think that sort of illustrates the kind of model of discipline that he didn't demand of everybody else, but he sort of set an example of that.
One more question has just occurred to me as you were talking. Mm-hmm. We talk about how he seemed to have had time to do so much. To what extent do you think his family was a big part of
huge,
that?
Huge. I think when we were in Ithaca last year, I heard people talking about how, he would have his seminar students over, and Sandy said, and I made the dinner. And I felt like, yes, that is really important to say, that, it was this kind of team effort, that he had a partner who made the dinner. And I'm sure did a million other things. But I feel like that was part of it. I also think he made decisions that, I think at times were hard on his family, like staying in his office hours until he had seen every student. I know that went way past the dinner hour. So I think dinner was waiting for him when he got home, and I think that was also made possible by Sandy. So I feel like there was a lot of support for that.
Okay, well, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.